They handed me the order at dusk, her name, her lineage, and the command to end her before sunrise. The parchment felt heavier than iron in my calloused hands as I stood in the shadow of the Colosseum's lower chambers, where the scent of blood never truly faded, and the echoes of 10,000 deaths whispered from every stone. Marcus Drusus, they called me now, though that name belonged to a life I could barely remember, a life before Rome stripped away everything I was and forged me into something I never chose to become. The Lannister's words still rang in my ears, like the clash of steel on bone. She is the last of the Iceni bloodline. The Emperor wants no traces left of Boudica's rebellion, not even her great-granddaughter's shadow. You will find her in the condemned quarters. You will make it quick. You will make it silent. His eyes had held the cold calculation of a man who measured human lives in coin, each death a transaction in Rome's endless ledger of conquest. I had nodded, as I always did. What choice did a slave have, even one who carried the crowd's favor and bore the scars of 100 victories? The gladiator who refused orders died not in glorious combat, but choking on his own blood in some forgotten corner, his name erased from history as thoroughly as if he had never drawn breath. But as I made my way through the labyrinthine passages beneath the city, past cells that housed the condemned and the forgotten, something stirred in my chest that I had thought Rome had carved out of me years ago. Doubt. Perhaps it was the way the order had been delivered, whispered rather than proclaimed. Perhaps it was the nervous tremor in the Lannister's voice when he spoke her name, as if even saying it aloud might summon ghosts better left buried. The condemned quarters lay in the deepest part of the prison complex, where the air hung thick with despair, and the walls wept moisture that never dried. Here, Rome stored those who had committed the unforgivable sin of existing when the empire decided they should not. Political prisoners, the relatives of rebels, children whose only crime was carrying the wrong blood in their veins, all waiting for their names to be called for the final time. Before we go deeper, remember to subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains for more hidden histories the world forgot. I had walked these corridors before, collecting prisoners for the games, leading trembling souls to deaths designed to entertain the masses. But tonight felt different. Tonight the shadows seemed to press closer, and the silence carried a weight that made each step feel like a betrayal of something I couldn't name. Her cell was at the very end of the corridor, separated from the others by a stretch of empty stone that spoke of isolation even among the condemned. The guard who accompanied me, a thick-necked Gaul whose loyalty Rome had purchased with bread and the promise of citizenship, gestured toward the iron-barred door with practiced indifference. "That one's been quiet since they brought her in. Hardly eats, never speaks. Some say she's mad with grief." The key turned with a sound like breaking bones, and the door swung open on hinges that groaned like tortured souls. Inside, in the dim light that filtered through a crack in the stone ceiling, I saw her for the first time. She sat with her back against the far wall, her dark hair falling like a curtain around shoulders that should have been broken by weeks in this place, but somehow remained unbowed. Her dress, once fine, was now little more than rags, but she wore them with a dignity that no amount of degradation could strip away. When she looked up at me, I saw eyes that held no fear, only a weariness that spoke of losses too great to mourn. "You've come to kill me," she said, and her voice was like wind through autumn leaves, soft, but carrying the promise of inevitable change. It wasn't a question. In this place, my presence could mean only one thing. I should have drawn my blade then. I should have ended it quickly, mercifully, and walked away with one more death on my conscience but no more doubt in my heart. Instead, I found myself stepping into the cell, my hand resting on the pommel of my gladius, but making no move to draw it. "What is your name?" I asked. though I already knew it from the order that burned in my mind like a brand. Does it matter? You're here to erase me from the world. Whether you know my name or not changes nothing. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made me feel as if she could see through the armor of scars and calluses I had built around my soul. You're not like the others they've sent. Others. 3 men have stood where you stand now. 3 times they've tried to make my death appear natural, quiet, unnoticed. 3 times they've failed to raise their blades. Her lips curved in what might have been a smile, if smiles could hold such profound sadness. Each time they send someone stronger, more feared in the arena. You must be their finest killer to be given this task. I felt something crack inside my chest, not break, but crack, like ice beginning to thaw. I am Marcus Drusus. I have killed more men than I can count. I have never failed to complete a task. The words felt hollow even as I spoke them, a recitation of facts that belonged to someone else. Marcus Drusus, she repeated, as if tasting the name. That's not the name you were born with. How could she know that? How could this condemned woman, this last remnant of a rebellion crushed before my time, see through the identity that Rome had grafted onto me like armor? My birth name died the day I was brought to this city in chains. Names have power, even when we try to bury them. What did your mother call you? Before Rome decided who you should be? I hadn't thought of my mother in years, hadn't allowed myself to remember the woman who had sung lullabies in the dialect of my village, who had woven flowers into my hair when I was small, who had died trying to protect me from the soldiers who came to collect their tribute of young bodies for the arena. Calum, I whispered, the words scraping against my throat like broken glass. She called me Calum. Calum, sky. Her voice was gentle now, as if she understood the weight of what I had revealed. I am Alara, though Rome would have you believe that name never existed, just as they would have you believe your mother's songs were never sung. Something was happening to me in that cell, something that had never occurred in a lifetime of violence and obedience. The ice around my heart wasn't just cracking, it was melting, and with each drop that fell, I remembered what it felt like to be human rather than a weapon in human form. Why did they really send you to kill me? She asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. You are the last of Boudica's line. The Emperor fears that your existence might inspire another rebellion. The official reason felt thin and hollow when spoken aloud, a threadbare excuse covering something deeper and more desperate. There will be no rebellion. My people are gone, scattered to the winds or buried in unmarked graves. I'm no threat to the Empire's glory. She leaned forward slightly, and in the dim light, I could see the intelligence burning in her eyes like banked coals. They fear me for a different reason, don't they? I thought of the nervous tremor in the Lannister's voice, the way the order had been whispered rather than proclaimed, the insistence on silence and secrecy. They fear what you know, what I know and what I remember. Alara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Do you know why they've tried 3 times to kill me quietly, rather than simply executing me in the arena like so many others? I shook my head, though part of me was beginning to understand. Because if I die publicly, people might wonder why the last daughter of a defeated tribe warranted such attention. They might ask questions. They might demand to know what secrets died with me. She stood slowly, her movements graceful despite the chains around her ankles. I know where the others are hidden. Others? The survivors they claimed were all dead. The children they said were sold into slavery, but who were actually hidden away in safe houses throughout the city. The women they reported as executed, but who were secretly kept alive as leverage against future uprisings. Her eyes met mine, and I saw in them a fire that no amount of imprisonment could extinguish. I know their names, their locations, their stories. I am the only living record of Rome's carefully hidden mercy. The irony was bitter as poison. Rome, which prided itself on the absolute nature of its conquests, had secretly spared survivors of Boudicca's rebellion, not out of compassion, but as a tool of control. Dead martyrs could inspire future rebellions, but living hostages kept hidden away could prevent them. The families of potential rebels would think twice about rising against an empire that held their loved ones' lives in its hands. "If I die," Alara continued, "that knowledge dies with me. The survivors become truly lost, forgotten even by those who might search for them. Their families will never know their fate, and hope will die with ignorance." I understood now why the order had been whispered, why secrecy was paramount. If word spread that Rome had been secretly preserving survivors while publicly claiming total victory, it would undermine the very foundation of imperial propaganda. The empire's strength lay not just in its military might, but in its mythology of absolute conquest. "You want me to spare you so you can free them?" It wasn't a question. "I want you to remember that you have a choice." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the hope threaded through it like golden wire. "They've trained you to believe that you're nothing more than a weapon, but weapons don't feel guilt when they kill. They don't hesitate. They don't remember their mother's songs." The guard outside was growing restless. I could hear his feet shifting on the stone floor. Soon he would expect to see blood on my blade and death in the cell. Soon I would have to choose between the life I had been forced to live and the man I had almost forgotten I once was. I thought of the countless deaths I had witnessed in the arena, the way the crowd roared with pleasure at each fountain of blood. I thought of the prisoners I had led to their deaths, their faces resigned to their fate, their eyes empty of everything but acceptance. I thought of the woman who had sung to me in a language Rome had tried to erase, who had died believing her son would somehow survive the machinery of empire. "If I spare you, they will know. They will hunt us both." My voice was rough with emotion I hadn't felt in years. "Perhaps, or perhaps you're cleverer than they believe. Perhaps there's a way to make them think their order was carried out while ensuring it never was." She moved closer, and I could smell the scent that clung to her despite weeks of imprisonment, something like lavender and rain, a reminder of green fields and gentle seasons that seemed as distant as dreams. "How many guards are there between here and the streets?" "2, maybe 3. But there are patrols throughout the lower city, and the gates are watched." "What about the old aqueduct tunnels? The ones they sealed after the plague year?" I stared at her in surprise. How could she know about those? The tunnels had been closed for nearly a decade, their entrances walled up and forgotten by all but the engineers who had built them. "You've been planning this." "I've been hoping for this. There's a difference." She reached into the folds of her tattered dress and withdrew something small and dark, a piece of charcoal, the kind used for marking in the cells. "I've been mapping these passages in my mind since they brought me here. The old tunnels connect to the wine cellars beneath Marcus Crassus's villa. From there, it's possible to reach the Subura district. The Subura, Rome's most crowded and chaotic neighborhood, where the poor and the foreign mingled in a maze of narrow streets and cramped tenements. A place where questions were rarely asked, and strangers could disappear into the crowd like raindrops into the sea. You're asking me to commit treason against the empire that made me." But even as I said it, I knew my decision was already made. Something had awakened in me in that cell, something that had been sleeping since the day they first put a sword in my hands and told me to kill or die. "I'm asking you to remember that before they made you into Marcus Drusus, you were Calum, son of a woman who sang to you about a world where children didn't have to choose between slavery and death." Alara's hand touched my arm. her fingers light as feathers, but somehow containing the weight of 1,000 unspoken pleas. "I'm asking you to choose who you really are." The key was still in the lock. The guard was still waiting outside, expecting to see me emerge alone. But everything had changed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. In the moment when a condemned woman spoke my true name and reminded me that I had once been more than Rome's weapon. I pulled the dagger from my belt, not my gladius, which was too recognizable, but the simple iron blade I used for practical tasks. In one swift motion, I cut a long gash across my forearm, letting the blood flow freely onto the stone floor of the cell. Then I took the charcoal from Alara's hand and smeared it across her face and arms, creating the illusion of bruising in the dim light. When the guard looks in, he'll see blood and shadows. He'll assume the task is done and leave us alone until dawn. I tore a strip from my tunic and bound the wound on my arm. The pain sharp and clean compared to the ache that had lived in my chest for so many years. By then we'll be gone. We? Did you think I could send you into those tunnels alone? You know where the survivors are hidden, but you don't know the city's underbelly like I do. We go together, or neither of us goes at all. For the first time since I had entered the cell, Alara smiled, not the sad, weary expression she had worn before, but something bright and fierce and alive. Then we go together. The next hour passed like a fever dream. I struck the bars of the cell with my dagger, creating the sharp, violent sounds the guard expected to hear. I spoke commands, in the harsh tone every Roman expected from a gladiator, and I made sure the scuff of my boots suggested a struggle. When the guard peered through the small window in the door, all he saw was blood pooled on the stone floor and two figures in the shadows, one standing victorious, one crumpled and still. "Is it done?" he asked in his thick Gallic accent. "It's done. The body can be removed at dawn with the others." I kept my voice flat, professional, the tone of a man completing routine business. He grunted his approval and moved away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he returned to his post. We waited in silence until the sounds faded completely, then began the delicate work of escape. The entrance to the old aqueduct tunnels lay 3 levels below the condemned quarters, accessible through a maintenance shaft that had been forgotten when the new water system was built. Alara moved through the passages like a shadow, her knowledge of the layout uncanny in its precision. I began to understand that her imprisonment had not been the beginning of her time in Rome, but merely the latest chapter in a much longer story. "How long have you been in the city?" I asked as we descended through a narrow chimney that connected the prison levels to the ancient waterways. 5 years. I came here voluntarily, following rumors that some of my people had survived. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of our feet on wet stone. I've been searching for them ever since, working as a servant in various households, listening to gossip in the markets, mapping every secret and hidden place I could find. And they caught you. Eventually, someone recognized me from a description, probably one of the soldiers who had been present at my grandmother's execution. They've been watching me for months, waiting to see if I would lead them to other survivors before they moved against me. We emerged into the main tunnel, a vast stone channel that had once carried fresh water from the mountains to the heart of the empire. Now it was dry and echoing, filled with the scurrying sounds of rats and the distant drip of moisture from cracked stones. But it was also forgotten, invisible to the patrols that watched the streets above. "The first safe house is in the Subura," Alara said as we made our way through the tunnel, guided by the faint light that filtered down through grates in the street above. 3 children and an elderly woman who was my grandmother's sister. They've been told I was executed weeks ago. The thought of those children, waiting in hiding for news that would never come, sent a spike of anger through my chest. How many others were scattered throughout the city, living in limbo between hope and despair, not knowing whether their loved ones lived or died? How many safe houses are there? 17 that I know of, perhaps more that were established after I was captured. She paused at a junction in the tunnel, listening for sounds from above. 43 people in total, including children who don't even remember their real names. 43 lives hanging in the balance of what we did in the next few hours. 43 people whose continued existence challenged the Empire's carefully constructed narrative of absolute victory and total conquest. The first safe house was hidden in the basement of a bakery, whose owner had been secretly sympathetic to conquered peoples for years. We emerged from the tunnels through a grate that opened into the building's storeroom, startling a thin woman who was grinding grain by candlelight. "Alara?" The woman's voice cracked with disbelief and hope in equal measure. "They said you were dead. They said the Romans had finally—" "I'm alive, grandmother, but not for long if we stay here." Alara moved quickly to embrace the older woman, and I saw tears streaming down both their faces. "We have to go, all of us, tonight." "Where? Where can we go that they won't find us?" That was the question I had been dreading. Rome's reach extended far beyond the city walls, its network of roads and fortresses and allies covering most of the known world. But there were still places, still pockets of resistance and independence where refugees might find sanctuary. "The Germanic tribes across the Rhine," I said. "Some of them still remember what it was like before Rome came. They might offer shelter to those fleeing imperial justice." "That's weeks of travel through hostile territory," the old woman protested, "with children, with no supplies, no protection. I know the roads. I know which patrols to avoid and which merchants can be trusted. I had fought in campaigns across the empire, had seen the maps and learned the routes that armies used to move unseen. More importantly, I know how Romans think. Because I was trained to think like them, I can get us past their defenses." Over the next several hours, we moved through the city like ghosts, collecting the scattered survivors from their hiding places. Each safe house held its own tragedy. Children who flinched at loud noises, women who had aged decades in a few years, men who spoke only in whispers as if normal voices might betray their location. But there was also something else. Hope. As word spread that Alara lived, that someone had finally come to lead them away from their hidden prisons, I saw faces brighten with possibilities they had almost forgotten existed. These people had survived because they refused to surrender, and now they sensed that their long exile might finally be ending. The most dangerous part of our escape came as we gathered at the predetermined meeting point, an abandoned temple to a god whose name had been chiseled away when Rome decided his worship was no longer acceptable. 43 people, including a dozen children, huddled in the shadows of broken columns while I scouted the routes out of the city. It was then that I heard the footsteps. Not the random patrol of guards making their rounds, but the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Someone who had been tracking us, following our movements with the patience of a predator. "Calum!" The voice came from behind me, smooth and cultured and utterly familiar. I turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows between the ruined statues, a man I had hoped never to see again, dressed in the purple-striped toga of a Roman senator but moving with the lethal grace of a trained killer. Lucius Septimus. My former master, the man who had purchased me from the slave markets and trained me to kill for entertainment. The man who had shaped me into Marcus Drusus and tried to erase every trace of Calum from my soul. "I must admit, I'm impressed," he said, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "When they told me you had gone rogue, I didn't believe it. Marcus Drusus, turning against the empire that made him. Impossible. But then I remembered that before you were Marcus, you were something else entirely. Behind me, I could sense the survivors pressing deeper into the shadows, parents pulling children close, and old hands reaching for whatever weapons they could find. They knew that discovery meant death, not just for them, but for their families, their friends, anyone who had ever helped them survive. How did you find us? I kept my voice steady, professional, the tone of one predator speaking to another. Oh, I've been watching you for weeks, ever since the Lanista mentioned that you seemed distracted during training, ever since the guards reported that you had been asking unusual questions about the condemned quarters. He stepped closer, and I could see that he carried no visible weapons, which meant he was confident enough in his abilities to face me with hands alone. Did you really think you could hide from the man who taught you everything you know? I learned to kill from you, but I learned to be human from someone else. Your mother. His laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. That barbarian woman who filled your head with songs and stories, I should have had her memory beaten out of you more thoroughly. The rage that filled me at those words was different from anything I had felt in the arena. This wasn't the calculated fury of combat, but something deeper and more primitive, the wrath of a son hearing his mother's memory defiled. You made one mistake, Lucius. I drew my gladius slowly, letting the steel sing as it cleared the scabbard. You taught me to fight like a Roman, but you never broke the part of me that remembers how to die like a free man. The battle that followed was nothing like the choreographed violence of the arena. There, combat was performance as much as skill, designed to entertain and thrill the crowd with displays of courage and technique. This was pure lethality, two men trying to kill each other with the efficiency of long practice. Lucius was faster than I had expected, his senatorial robes hiding muscles that remained hard despite his years away from active combat. He fought with the ruthless precision of someone who had survived decades of political intrigue, every move calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. But I had learned things in the arena that no amount of private training could teach. I had faced desperate men fighting for their lives, had adapted to opponents who fought with the fury of the doomed, had survived by learning to read the intentions in an enemy's eyes before his muscles even began to move. More importantly, I was fighting for something beyond my own survival. Behind me were 43 people who represented the last hope of a conquered nation, and beyond them was a woman whose courage had awakened something in me that I had thought was dead forever. The end came suddenly, as these things always do. Lucius overextended himself in a thrust aimed at my heart, and I slipped aside and drove my gladius up under his ribs, finding the gap between armor plates with the precision of long experience. He looked at me with surprise, as if he couldn't believe that the weapon he had forged had finally turned against its maker. "You were always the finest student I ever trained," he whispered, as the light faded from his eyes. I'm almost proud. I held him as he died, this man who had shaped me into a killer but had never quite succeeded in destroying the boy who remembered his mother's songs. When his breathing stopped, I closed his eyes and whispered a prayer in the language of my childhood, not for his soul, which was beyond redemption, but for the forgiveness of all those he had helped to destroy. "Is it over?" Alara's voice came from the darkness behind me. "It's over, but we have to move quickly now. When he doesn't report back, they'll send others." I cleaned my blade and sheathed it, trying to push down the emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. There would be time to mourn and rage and celebrate when the survivors were safe. Now there was only the escape. The journey out of Rome took the rest of the night and most of the following day. We moved in small groups, using the network of tunnels and abandoned buildings that I had learned during my years in the city's underworld. Alara proved to be as skilled at organizing people as she was at gathering intelligence, keeping the children quiet and the adults focused on the task ahead. By sunset, we had reached the old Flaminian Way, the road that would take us north toward the Rhine and the Germanic territories beyond. Behind us, Rome's 7 hills were silhouetted against the dying light, the greatest city in the world, continuing its eternal business of conquest and control. But ahead of us lay possibility, dangerous and uncertain, but real nonetheless. For the first time in years, these people would sleep without fear of midnight arrests. For the first time since their worlds had been destroyed, they would wake up with hope for the future. "What will you do now?" Dosen, Alara asked as we made camp in a grove of olive trees that had been abandoned when their owner fell victim to political purges. "You can't go back. They'll never stop hunting you." I thought about that question as I watched the children play in the firelight, their laughter strange and wonderful after so many years of enforced silence. What did a gladiator do when he was no longer a gladiator? What did a slave do when he had finally chosen freedom over survival? I'll do what I should have done years ago. I'll remember who I was before they tried to make me into something else. I looked at her across the fire, this woman who had saved my soul by refusing to let me take her life. And I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to undo some of the damage I helped them cause. The damage isn't yours alone. You were as much their prisoner as any of us. Perhaps. But I had choices, even if I didn't see them at the time. I could have found ways to resist, ways to preserve something of myself, despite what they demanded of me. I picked up a handful of dirt and let it run through my fingers, thinking of all the places I had seen in my travels with the legions. There are other survivors scattered across the empire, other hidden communities, other people living in shadows and hoping for rescue. If we could find them, help them escape. You're talking about a lifetime of work, a lifetime of danger. I'm talking about a lifetime of purpose. I stood and looked back toward Rome, its lights twinkling in the distance like stars fallen to earth. They made me into a weapon designed to serve their glory. Perhaps it's time I became a weapon designed to preserve their victims instead. The years that followed became the stuff of legend, though the legends were told in whispered voices around hidden fires rather than proclaimed in public squares. They spoke of a gladiator who had turned against his masters, of a woman who remembered the names of the forgotten, of a network of safe houses and secret routes that spirited survivors away from imperial justice. Some of the stories were true. We did establish a network of refugees stretching from the Rhine frontier to the mountains of Dacia. We did help hundreds of people escape the fate that Rome had planned for them. We did prove that even the mightiest empire in the world could not control everyone, could not erase every inconvenient truth. Other stories were embellished, as stories always are when they pass from mouth to mouth across generations. But perhaps the embellishments were necessary. Perhaps people needed to believe that resistance was possible, that love could triumph over hatred, that a single act of courage could change the course of history. The truth was simpler and more human than the legends suggested. I was not a hero, merely a man who finally remembered that he had a choice. Alara was not a mystical figure, merely a woman who refused to let hope die, even in the darkest circumstances. Together, we did what we could with the time we had, saving who we could save and honoring those we could not. And in the end, that was enough. When stories like this survive only because someone chose to remember, subscribe so none of them are lost again.